After a few seconds of mental probing, the Queen was now absolutely certain. This woman was Margaret, once one of her closest friends. A cold wind blew through the historic streets of London. As the orange light of sunset reflected on the city's majestic buildings, people were caught up in their daily bustle. Some were returning from work, some were window shopping, some were hurrying to get somewhere. In the crowd, there was one figure walking with calm and dignity: Queen Elizabeth. The Queen liked to walk among the people, away from the palace. Walking the streets, she could feel the real world of her people more closely. These walks were not just a stroll for her, they were a way of establishing an invisible bond with her people. She was accompanied by no one except a few security guards. He didn't like to show off. After all, real power didn't need to be flaunted. But tonight's walk would be very different from a normal walk. A shadow on the sidewalk caught her attention, a woman wrapped in an old coat to protect herself from the cold, her eyes squinting like the eyes of a freezing cat, her face full of lines. Most people didn't even notice her presence, or if they did, they passed by quickly, ignoring her. But something told the Queen that this woman was someone she had known before. Her face was strangely familiar to her. An old door opened in her memory, and she was transported back to her childhood. In the eyes of this strange woman, she saw the eyes of the cheerful girl with whom she had once played in the palace gardens. After a few seconds of searching her mind, the Queen was now absolutely certain. This woman was Margaret, once one of her closest friends. Margaret's face was sunken with years of fatigue. The dark circles in her eyes bore the scars of sleepless nights on the streets, hunger and poverty. Looking into Margaret's eyes, Elizabeth saw not only a homeless woman, but also an old friend with whom she had shared the joyful days of her childhood. Sadness overcame her. How cruel time was. Two little girls who once ran together in the palace gardens now lived completely different lives. One ruled a country, the other struggled to survive. But Margaret was still alive, and right in front of her. She still had a chance to save her old friend from her misery. The Queen squatted slightly and touched Margaret's shoulder. The woman raised her eyes and looked up at Queen Elizabeth. She was surprised because no one had come near her to talk to her for a long time. The streets taught one to be ruthless. People often averted their eyes or looked at her with contempt. But Elizabeth's eyes held only sincere compassion. Margaret recognized Queen Elizabeth immediately. "Your Majesty, I didn't want you to see me like this," she said. The Queen shook her head from side to side with a slight smile. "Please, call me Elizabeth. You are my childhood friend. Now tell me, why are you on the street?" Margaret took a deep breath and began to tell the story she had been hiding for years. "My father was the gardener at the palace, and when he died, everything changed. We had to leave the palace, and my mother was sick and couldn't work. At first, I found a job in a sewing workshop. I tried, I resisted, but life is not always kind. When I got married, I thought everything would be fine, but my husband left me. Finally, my landlord threw me out of the house. I was left with nothing. I have been on the streets ever since." As Margaret told her story, the wind picked up speed, as if it had heard her tale. As the Queen listened to the story, her gentle heart ached and tears welled up in her eyes. Margaret, on the contrary, did not even shed a tear, because the streets had taught her the hard way that crying was useless. "How did you endure all these years alone?" the Queen asked, her voice low but sincere. Margaret smiled slightly. "I don't know. Perhaps with hope, maybe by believing that one day everything would change. But you know what the hardest part was? Being invisible. People don't see me. They don't listen to me. They don't know that I had a life once. To them, I am just a street beggar." Queen Elizabeth sighed. Margaret's pain was evident on her face as she said these words. People had ignored her and abandoned her to her fate when she needed help the most. But Elizabeth would not make the same mistake as other people. "You are no longer alone, Margaret," the Queen said, a determined look in her eyes. Margaret looked surprised at Elizabeth's words. "But she said, at a loss for words. The Queen smiled and added, "This is what true friends are for." Margaret remained silent at these words. For the first time in years, she really felt that someone cared about her, and yet, after all these years, having the Queen help her felt like a burden. "But Elizabeth, you are a queen. You have important things to do. And Elizabeth interrupted him. "And you are my childhood friend, and friends stick together through the hard times." Then she turned to the officers behind her. "Find him a place to stay. I won't let him stay on the street even today." Margaret's eyes widened. "You would really do that?" Elizabeth smiled at her, tilting her head slightly. "I am not just a queen, Margaret. I am your friend." At that moment, Margaret's emotions were indescribable. Years of fear, loneliness, helplessness. All of them were suddenly replaced by great joy. For the first time, she felt truly safe. That night, Margaret was checked into a luxury hotel. She took a hot bath, put on clean clothes, and lay down on a soft bed. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without shivering from the cold. But it wasn't just physical comfort that made a difference. For the first time, hope had blossomed inside her, and that light was the Queen's hand of friendship. The next day, the Queen asked for a permanent solution for Margaret. She placed her in a secure job at the palace. She also helped her find a place to live. Margaret's life was completely changed by the Queen's instructions. Days later, the two old friends met again. But this time, Margaret was clean, warmly dressed, her hair neatly combed and not tired. She was 20 years younger. He looked at the Queen with tears in his eyes. "Elizabeth, I don't know how to thank you." The Queen put a friendly hand on her shoulder. "No matter how cruel life is, Margaret, it is the ability to get up again when you fall that counts." Thanks to Queen Elizabeth, another woman had clung to life. If you like Queen Elizabeth's amazing stories, don't forget to subscribe and like the channel.